welcome to our FabFilter course, and this is the fourth video. I'm going to be showing you the Pro L2, which is the successor to FabFilter's Pro L limiter. You're going to usually use this in some sort of mastering context. It's a really great limiter. It's incredibly transparent if you want it to be. It deals fantastically with high dynamic range material with high crest factors, and it has also a very pretty user interface that has several different modes. I'm going to cycle through those modes while playing for you a production I have here in Ableton Live 10. While that plays, I'm just going to cycle through 4 different new visualization algorithms that will allow you to see the audio level data in good detail, but also each of them has their own advantages, like being able to visualize audio level data over a longer period of time, as is the case with the modes like the slow scroll mode and also the infinity mode, which is I'm going to show you at the end. So I'm going to play the sound, and I'm just going to cycle through these. Okay, so this is these are the 4 visualization modes. This last one is called the infinity mode, and it basically, or the infinite scrolling mode, and it basically halves what's on the screen, and it keeps everything on the screen, and then once it fills the entire frame, it just splits it in half, and then splits also the scrubbing rate in half, so that you can get a theoretically infinite amount of material. This is particularly useful if you want to look at this RMS value and look at the gain reduction trace over a longer period of time. You can make certain parameter adjustments and then watch them, watch how they stack up against other sections over a pretty long period of time. So that's a pretty useful feature. My personal favorite is the first one. Shows a pretty good resolution, but also it keeps the thing going, and I like how the whole thing kind of looks like a video game. It's a very professional looking UI. But what's even more impressive is this metering system, which you can enable by pressing this bottom right button. Usually you're going to get a meter scale value that I think we covered in other videos. But to get this particular meter, you just have to click the loudness button, and this is going to show you the loudness meter. All these other meter scales and meters, so what they do is they're just basically, especially these K12, K14, K20 meters, they're designed to accommodate for various international broadcasting standards and radio standards. So they're not really of interest to us currently. But the loudness meter, on the other hand, allows you to make very concrete assessments about your RMS, which is really useful if you're looking to maximize your music for the radio or for SoundCloud or whatever. So this is the meter you want to be looking at. A really cool feature of this meter is that you're able to actually set your own custom target RMS. You have a preset list of RMS values that are considered to be standard. For instance, -9 RMS for CD quality music. Nowadays, -9 would seem fairly conservative. A lot of music you hear nowadays, especially modern EDM tracks, they tend to be somewhere around -3, -4, even -2 in some extreme cases. So actually, these kinds of limiters, especially the Pro L, let you achieve RMS values like that while still retaining clarity. The biggest challenge that I find when I try to maximize a track, especially in the house domain, is retaining the power in the drums. The drums tend to be the first things to go, especially if the mix down isn't perfect and there wasn't a lot of work done to reconcile the low end between the drums and the bass. Usually the drums tend to be the first to get crushed. So you need to be extra careful not to lose definition and power in the drums while still retaining, while still maximizing as much as possible. So I'm going to show you some techniques pertaining to that. Before we get into that though, I just want to quickly cover a new feature in Pro L2, which relatively few limiters have, and it's called true peak limiting. You also have true peak metering. What true peak limiting is it's an intelligent limiting algorithm that accounts for the fact that what your run-of-the-mill digital limiter tells you isn't when a run-of-the-mill digital limiter tells you it's not clipping, it's probably lying, because what it doesn't account for is what's called intersample clipping. Basically, any piece of digital audio is composed of many samples glued together, played at a very fast rate, what's called a sample rate, and that's how you get your sound. So typical sample rate, one has been standard for a very long time, is 44.1 kilohertz. It means that you have 441,000 samples in a second. That's a pretty high rate, but nevertheless, it's very easy to get clipping that breaks past your unity level or 0 decibels that occurs in between those samples. And so what can happen is that when you play your track that's meant to be limited at 0 decibels, when you play that on a system that may be a little old, or may even be new but doesn't have certain properties that prevent this kind of clipping to happen, like headroom, what can happen is that you can get a lot of really weird distortion and clipping. You can also get a lot of weird aliasing problems if you don't account for the fact that you can have very serious intersample clipping, especially if you're not using something like oversampling, which you can do here in this particular plugin. You can oversample up to 32 times, which, as the plugin is warning you, can be very CPU intensive. But if you have the appropriate computer, you could render out your final mix with a very high sample rate. This would actually or at least reduce the influence of intersample clipping by just increasing the samples and reducing the potential for those clipping events to occur by virtue of the fact that you just have a huge number of those samples pushed into a single second of time, and intersample clipping wouldn't be as apparent. It would be more evenly distributed and it would show up less on average. However, if you're using something like 44.1 kilohertz, intersample clipping could actually make a huge difference to your sound. And in fact, if you enable true peak limiting, it's pretty surprising just how it could affect your sound, especially if you're pushing your signal very hard into the limiter and getting a lot of gain reduction. So basically what true peak limiting does, in a few words, is it models how the signal you're playing would sound if it were converted through a DAC or a digital to analog converter, and it basically estimates what the clipping would be if this particular signal, having only been limited according to its digital gain values, what kind of clipping it would experience if played on a normal set of speakers. It estimates that, and then it limits accordingly to prevent that kind of clipping from ever happening. So it's a really awesome feature. It basically, it also safeguards against any potential rejections you may face by distribution agents or by certain broadcasting networks. For instance, if Spotify received a clip from you and they detected intersample clipping, that's worthy of just rejection. You're never going to be able to play something like that on a platform like Spotify or on the radio if you have intersample clipping, which manifests itself as actual distortion on any set of speakers. So definitely have this enabled. And I'm just going to show you what the meter is going to tell you. You can actually turn the meter on and off. You can turn off true peak metering on and off just to see just how much you would be clipping if you weren't using this algorithm. Some people, what they do is they would make the limiter ceiling slightly lower than unity, which means, they would set their limiters at a ceiling of minus 0.3 decibels or 0.2 decibels. I'm sorry to say, but according to the values that you see here sometimes, the true peak values, not your digital peak values, it can vast exceed that little margin that you allow. You can get true peaks that go upwards of 4 decibels over unity. It's pretty impressive, and it's illuminating just how big of a problem this can cause. So let's start actually limiting this this track that I have. I'm going to show you what all these parameters do, and just some other cool features that show up when you hold your mouse over this out button. So dBTP, decibels true peak, is the output that's going to be that's according to the true peak value and not the actual digital peak value. If you have true peak limiting enabled, you're going to be seeing decibels true peak and not just decibels. So let's start bringing up the gain. One thing before I want to actually bring up the gain and ruin everybody's hearing is that another really awesome feature that this limiter has is that you're able to hover over here and then click the 1-to-1 button. What this allows you to do now is you can bring up the gain as much as you want, and it's going to actually bring down the output gain of the limiter. So no matter how much you increase the gain here, it's going to be the output of the limiter is actually going to be reduced concurrently. So what that means is that you can hear exactly what the limiter is doing without having that distracting increase in volume that is associated with increasing gain. As you can see, you start to get these, notifications of gain reduction events. And whenever you're using the 1-to-1 button here, the 1-to-1 mode, you're going to start getting a yellow bar, which is indicating that this isn't actually the true volume of your master. It's the volume as it was reduced according to your gain input. So at about 13 decibels of gain, let me actually use the longer scrolling. Can get a bit distracting at times. So about 13 decibels of gain, we start to hear some significant distortion. In order to modify that somehow and reduce it, you would want to open up your advanced panel and look at these different parameters, because these parameters have a direct bearing on how distorted your signal can become. Gain is obviously the most important factor. If something is going in way too loud into the limiter, then you're going to get distortion no matter what. However, one thing you need to understand about how this particular limiter works is that it's set up in 2 stages. You have a first stage, which is affected by the things like look ahead, attack, and release. It's a softer limiter. And then at the end, you have as the second stage, which is like a hard brick wall limiter, past which nothing is allowed to go through. So you can have sort of general dynamics control and maximization happening as it's controlled by the software limiter, and it's going to operate according to these parameters that you set. And then after that dynamics control has been applied, the brick wall limiter makes sure that nothing will actually pass the ceiling that you set. So if you start to increase your attack values, that means that there's going to be more and more time for the limiter, the first soft limiter, to react before the sound is actually going to go and hit the brick wall limiter. If your attack values are too high, then most of your incoming sound is going to hit the brick wall limiter and it's going to sound distorted because it's going to be hard clipping everything. Whereas if your attack values are lower, you can tame the signal and tame its attacks, tame the attacks of the transients before they hit the brick wall limiter, so that the brick wall limiter doesn't clip the signal very hard. And what that would result in ultimately is a much softer, more transparent limiting. That's not to say that you're going to have a softer sound or less powerful drums or anything like that. It's just that you're going to reduce distortion as much as possible. And the whole balancing act involved in using a limiter like this is balancing between the first softer limiter, controlling your dynamics, maximizing as much as possible by using these attack and release values, and then bringing up the gain as much as possible until these parameters reach the maximum allowance before the brick wall limiter is going to start to introduce distortion. So you got to set these by ear largely. I mean, you have a bunch of different presets, and those are pretty awesome. But ideally, you want to listen to these parameters, hear what they're doing, and learn exactly what actually starts to happen to the sound once you start to modify them in some way. That way, you're going to internalize the actual mechanisms that govern this limiter and limiting in general. So you're never going to be trying aimlessly to maximize your song, and you have no idea why it's not sounding loud when your release values are all the way up and your limiter never has time to catch up. So it's just little things like that I'm just going to try and demonstrate right now. So right now what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep my look ahead all the way down at 0. Look ahead is basically a feature that allows the limiter to look ahead of itself according to the amount of time that you give it, that you give this value. So 2.5 milliseconds of look ahead means that the limiter is actually going to start ducking the signal 2.5 milliseconds ahead of the transients. What that entails is generally much more transparent limiting, but at the same time, too much look ahead can result in your transients losing any definition that they had. And the whole idea is to retain the definition in the transients. So what I like to do, I like to keep the look ahead all the way down, and if the transients really become a problem, and there's just no way of bringing up the RMS without completely destroying the drums, then I'm going to start looking at using some look ahead to preempt the transients a bit and to get the limiter to work in a more efficient manner. For now, I don't think it's going to be required. You can select the style according to what kind of style of music you're mastering. My favorite one has always been dynamic. These ones have been around since Pro L: transparent, punchy, dynamic, and all round. These 4 new ones, they've been added with Pro L2. The first one that's default that opens with the limiter is the modern preset, or the modern style. It's quite good. I don't think it's as good as the dynamic style. These differ in how they sound, in how they treat transients, in how these values are preset, and also the programs that underlie a lot of these parameters, because you have to remember, this limiter is meant to largely be governed by a lot of program-based modulations. So basically, you have a program that underlies the release knob. You set the release and you set a certain time for the release, but ultimately, the limiter actually has a set of very highly intelligent algorithms that automatically decide how to apply release, and it's going to use the value that you entered as a general guideline. So the nature of those algorithms changes with the style that you select. And it all comes down to taste. The aggressive style, for instance, has been developed with a lot of modern EDM in mind. You might want to try this one out if you're in that genre. So again, set your attacks high enough that your drums are able to come through and retain their power, but at the same time, don't set it so high that your drums have absolutely no control by the soft limiting stage and go head first into the brick wall limiter, because you're just going to get distorted sludge, and that's never good. I'm going to show you what that might sound like. So let me just increase the attack. It's pretty cool to see the RMS be averaged like this. This is what I meant when I was talking about observing long-term trends with these kinds of slow metering modes. What I just showed you is obviously terribly exaggerated, and it's so distorted that clearly nobody would ever listen to this. However, bringing down the attack would actually bring it under control somewhat. The distortion would disappear because the limiter would be engaging immediately upon any sort of transient coming through. So the negative consequence is that we're losing a bit of, obviously having the attack so low and having the gain so high it's not a combination that's really worthy of our time, because the result is a quieter signal. We're getting less RMS than we ideally should be, and we're just getting diminishing returns by increasing our gain into a limiter that has incredibly fast attack and a release. It's a normal release time, but the attack is 14 milliseconds. Only 14 milliseconds of our fastest drums are being played, but they're immediately getting crushed, and then the release time doesn't let them come back up. So what you want to do is you want to balance these out with a gain that gives you a decent rough estimate of the overall RMS that you're looking for off the bat. And then you want to tailor these not to maximize headroom, but to play with the limits of what you can, of how close you can get to the brick wall without getting any distortion. So this should be primarily done not with headroom or not with loudness in mind, but with definition in mind. You want to keep the drums under control. You want to make sure everything is well defined, and you want to make sure there isn't any weird pumping effects. Those kinds of pumping effects can happen if your release values are too short or too long. So these things need to be, although the program is very smart in how it decides these release values, make sure you don't have anything out of whack that's too short or too long, because you're going to get really weird artifacts. So longer release values tend to result in more transparent limiting. Shorter release values tend to give you a louder result, however, at the expense of definition sometimes and consistency. A lot of what can happen is that some drums, some individual drums, like say a clap in a particular phrase of a hook, in a particular phrase where there's a lot of instrumentation, those claps can sound more pumping than other ones. And that is really off-putting and unprofessional sounding. Everything has to be at a relatively constant level, and the drums shouldn't be losing or gaining power from hit to hit. You need to set these attack and release values according to how constant you can get everything to sit, as well as how much power you could retain and definition you can retain. So I'm going to keep on raising the gain without too much comment, and I'm going to start adjusting these to what I think are the best parameters. I suggest you listen along and just listen to how the different settings affect the sound. Okay, so right now I set the attack and release to what I think are pretty much optimal settings. There's still quite a bit of distortion. So what we're going to do then is try looking at changing the look ahead values, try different styles, and with the new styles, we're going to also look at these parameters, and finally look at the gain to see if we could reduce the gain a little bit, because at a certain point you start to get diminishing returns. One other thing you want to look at is the channel linking. You can link your stereo channels like I showed you how to do in the Pro G video. You can link them according to your transients. Stereo linked transients tend to be less powerful because there's processing involved that links them together. Whereas if you let them be unlinked, you tend to get much stronger, more transparent transient control. However, so I would recommend unlinking your or stereo unlinking your transients. However, linking your release times on both of your stereo channels is a pretty decent idea, although it really is up to personal taste how you adjust these values. For instance, if you stereo unlink your release, you're going to get interesting stereo fluctuations, and the limiter is kind of going to distribute its maximization across the stereo field in a rather interesting way. If you like how that sounds and you're not particularly worried about transients being lost, then you can unlink your release times and also unlink the transients. Okay, so there's still a bit of distortion there. Since I unlinked the transients, the left and right channel are being treated independently and limited independently. That's going to get us a more accurate limiting when it comes to the transients. However, the release, I want the release to be relatively stable across both channels, so I'm going to link the left and right channel. The distortion primarily is being caused First of all, by the style that I chose, and second of all, by the gain that I'm using. It's a bit too high. So let's try changing that and then adjusting our style accordingly. Alright, so we're getting there. It's pretty impressive. 12 decibels of headroom on a unmastered, unmixed track it's pretty impressive just how clear you can get it. There's still some distortion because, as I said earlier, look at this gain reduction. It's very uneven and it's pretty much entirely most of the gain reduction is happening on the individual drum hits. If you do some compression beforehand, you're going to get a much smoother limiting gain reduction trace. So you're not going to get a lot of that distortion that you're hearing right now. Yeah, this modern style is actually quite good. It's probably the cleanest when it comes to a lot of this low headroom material. Yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with that. So we managed to get some decent RMS in there. I can probably push the gain a bit more, but it's not really necessary. Our attack is at about 100 milliseconds. And we've managed to basically eliminate any distortion by using this modern style, which is quite good at dealing with a lot of this sort of very low headroom saturated material. Definitely have a look at using this one if you're working on any EDM or anything like that. So a lot of that distortion that we were hearing could also be attenuated a tiny bit by using oversampling. As I said earlier, a lot of the true peak clipping can occur if you're not using any kind of oversampling, which shouldn't even be a problem now because you're using true peak limiting. But in Pro L, the first version, you had oversampling, which was recommended to control true peak limiting, but you never actually had any sort of algorithms that could control it directly. Let me just show you another interesting set of features here. Aside from the 1-to-1 value which we're using here, you can also limit according to a sidechain. I discussed sidechaining in the last video if you want to look at how you set that up. You can eliminate DC offset distortion or aliasing caused by DC offset. And also this little headphone button, much like in the Pro C2, you can solo exactly what is surpassing the threshold and listen directly to the what exactly is being limited directly. If I was to take an educated guess, it would probably be the drums, most of all, that are passing through the limiter and being crushed. Let's press this button and have a listen. That makes me kind of sad because those are very juicy transients that are being cut out. That's why I said that you should definitely use a compressor before you feed your mix into a limiter like this. But again, I'm just demonstrating what this limiter can do. Nevertheless, even with that kind of gain reduction, we're getting a very transparent signal, and at the same time, it's quite loud. Let's play it again and try to see if we can hit that -5. Yeah, this dynamic one tends to distort quite a lot in the mid-range. I kind of like that, and it sometimes lends a very nice saturation to the track. In this particular instance, it's a bit too much because a lot of those Rhodes piano chords are very mid-heavy, and they're just getting lit up, and it's not really pleasant. Probably the modern setting is the best. All right. So without any prior compression, it's quite hard to keep on pushing. But then again, we're getting 12 decibels of gain reduction, and the result is a saltine cracker, as you can see by the RMS. 12 decibels of gain reduction is pretty insane, but we're still retaining basically full clarity. There's obviously a bit of distortion. What you would do to mediate that is increase your oversampling and maybe bring up your look ahead a bit. I'm not going to delve too deeply into these parameters, but those are up to your discretion, obviously. One last thing I want to show you is I wonder how much this would be clipping if I were to render out this mix limited as it is according to the digital gains within the samples and not true peak limiting. And let's see exactly how far we're breaking past unity. Let me turn off true peak limiting. I'm going to keep true peak metering on because it's going to show me the values over here. Right, so if I disable true peak limiting, then I'm going over 0 by 1.7 decibels. So even if you set your ceiling at minus 0.3, your true peaks are quite constantly breaking past that value. So your ceiling of minus 0.3 is useless if you're not taking account of true peaks. If you haven't been taking account of them, then you definitely should, because they've probably been making their way and creeping their way into your mastering and exerting a really nasty saturating effect on your sound that's quite difficult to get rid of. Finally, one last actual parameter that I would like to show you is the dithering feature. Dithering is something you could do within the Ableton Live DAW, but also you can do it from within this limiter. I'm going to use 16-bit dithering since I'm working within a 16-bit environment. And what dithering does is that it basically introduces some noise on purpose. It introduces a noise floor so that when you're going to be transcoding your wave rendering or your AIF format render, converting that to, say, an MP3 codec would actually destroy the quality and destroy a lot of the sensitive transient information to a degree that can be reduced if you're introducing a specific pattern of noise. And this specific pattern of noise is meant to take the brunt of a lot of that really aggressive artifacting and distortion that would otherwise affect the sound itself. And this is meant to sort of diffuse the damage that a lot of the transcoding can do. Again, at the risk of belaboring the point regarding true peak limiting, but the first thing that tends to really destroy sound quality when you're transcoding is actually true peaks that are blasting through your 0 dB red line without you ever knowing about it. And then when you actually convert your files into MP3, those get really prominent, and now you're actually able to take control of that. So I like to take an optimized noise shaping algorithm You can use weighted noise shaping that is more tailored to your track and how dynamic range is distributed in your track. This is basically just going to help your MP3 actually retain some of that quality that you've been working so hard at achieving when you're using this limiter. Cool. All right, so that's the Pro L2. I hope you employ this limiter responsibly. Don't go overboard with the dynamic range destruction like I just did. But also feel free to see just how far you can push your sound without completely losing all definition. Before you actually render, don't forget to click this one-to-one button to disable the one-to-one feature that you had running earlier, whereby your gain introduction was offset by an output reduction. So now let me destroy your ears with a demonstration of the new mastered product. Yeah, it's pretty impressive for -10, -11 decibels of gain reduction. That's a bit too much, and I would never do this normally, but it's just a demonstration of just how clear you can keep your signal at these kinds of insane levels of gain reduction.